Okay, hi everyone. I can't actually see myself here, so can I just check that everyone can hear me and see the presentation, more importantly than seeing me?
Okay, Will says yes.
Thank you very much. All right, so yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. Thanks very much for having me, and yeah, special thanks to Eugenia and to Paolo for the very kind invitation and for hosting me and for your wonderful hospitality. It's really been so nice to spend a couple of days in Trento. It's my privilege to be giving this talk in English, but where was I? Yeah, thank you very much for having me. So yes, this talk is, I'm pleased to be here and to discuss the Resilient Beliefs Project. Paolo originally asked me to give a talk connected with religion and delusion, but very kindly allowed me to give a talk about some of my recent work, which is about swearing. But I'm very interested in the resilient beliefs more generally, so very happy to stick around and to touch on different topics at the end of the presentation as well. Excuse me. So my presentation today is going to be in two parts. As Eugenia mentioned, I'll be exploring two different facets of swearing. And Ronald Reagan is illustrating the two different themes of my talk here. On the right, the profane variant of swearing. On the left, he's being sworn in for his first term as governor of California in 1967. This is a bit random, actually, but I'm endlessly fascinated by American politics, and I found that once I started with Reagan, I ended up cramming my talk with as many American presidents as I could. So see if you can spot them all. All right, so just to thank a couple of my collaborators. So the talk's going to be in two parts. In the first part of the talk, I'm going to tell you a little bit about my recent foray into psycholinguistics, and I'll tell you about some studies that I've run with my colleague Shiri Levari at Royal Holloway. In the second part of the talk, I'm going to return to one of my favorite topics, which is the relationship between religion and morality. And there I will tell you about some work that I've conducted with Colin Davis and Will Gervais. Now, it's my real privilege to be giving this talk in English. Unfortunately, I don't speak any Italian, but I want to make sure that I don't speak too quickly or that I'm clear enough. So please interrupt me if I need to slow down at all. Okay, so So you might think that there's not much of a deep connection between these two different aspects of swearing. I'll hope to convince you that that there's a bit more to it than at first meets the eye. But I was pleased to see this recent article. I'm not sure how much news it made here. The coronation of King Charles, probably people didn't care about it too much, but this was a big deal in the UK. And this very nice story came out a couple of weeks ago, which nicely combined the two themes of my talk. So it emerged that a translation of the oath of allegiance into Welsh was translated in such a way that people were encouraged to literally curse in a profane way at God. So this kind of unites the two themes. All right, so the first part of the talk is the profane. Now, in Italy, I'm not sure if your students are used to getting content warnings or trigger warnings. This is a big agenda that in the UK, people are poised to be outraged if you don't issue some kind of warning. So be warned that there will be some bad language in the first part of this talk, at least. But the topic is swearing, so what can you expect? All right, let's get started. So, yeah, I'm not sure if there are any science fiction enthusiasts in the audience here, but if you're a fan of sci-fi, you might have been exposed to profane language in non-human languages. So aficionados of Star Trek or Star Wars, for instance, know that words like grozit and fearfeck are not to be used in polite company. I'm not sure if any of you remember Battlestar Galactica, but you may be familiar with this swear word frack, as in this graffiti here, frack Earth. And fans of Robin Williams may remember his alien character Mork in Mork and Mindy crying out Shazbot when he would stub his toe or hit his head. I've got a little clip of this just to illustrate this. Okay, so writers who invent alien profanity like this presumably rely on their intuitions about what makes swear words offensive and transgressive here on Earth. But interestingly, the idea that the sounds in these words contribute to their offensiveness, that idea is itself somewhat transgressive because it violates a foundational principle of linguistics. And this is this principle of the arbitrariness of the sign. So the principle is that the relationship between the meaning and the sound of a word should be arbitrary. That's a really founding principle of linguistics. So just to illustrate this a little bit, I've got this gratuitous picture of my dog, Otto, here. Now, for me as a native English speaker, it almost seems, I'm so used to associating animals like Otto with the sound dog that there almost seems something essentially dog-like for me about this kind of creature, and something dog-like about those sounds. But of course, many of you in this room or online may associate a different set of sounds, carne, with this animal. And of course, across the world's languages, there's an extraordinary variability in the sounds that you use to refer to what I would call a dog. So just to give one more example, Ukrainians use the word sobaka to refer to a dog. So there's nothing essentially dog-like about this animal. It's just an arbitrary set of sounds. So that's the principle of arbitrariness. But despite this principle, a number of authors have suggested that swear words have sounds that are especially suited for their purposes. And actually, the general idea that sound can carry intrinsic meaning is called sound symbolism. And there are a few interesting examples of sound symbolism. So I'm just going to give you a couple of examples to try and drive this home. I'm not sure if any of you are familiar with these symbols here. So one of these symbols is called booba, and one of them is called kiki. So this is a bit of audience interaction here. Which one of these is booba and which one is kiki? Kiki's the one on the left, the spikier one, okay? Does everyone share that intuition? Sorry, I can't see any of you online, but looking at Eugenia's screen, William is nodding effusively. That's great. Okay, so it seems intuitive that one is kiki and that one is booba. Now, this is an effect that is very robust across very distant languages. So not just languages that are relatively closely related, like English and Italian, but people in very different cultures have that same intuition. Another example, so here's two tables, a small one and a large one. Now, one of these tables is mil and one of them is mal. Which one is which? Which is mil? The small one is mil. Okay, again, so people have that intuition quite reliably and quite strongly as well. And perhaps my favorite example is this example. So across the world's languages, the nasal sound is far more likely to be found in words for nose than in other words. In Italian, is it nase? Naso, okay. Yeah, so there are different authors have offered different speculations and theories about why these effects occur. In the case of nasal or nose, there's a shared quality of nasality that the sound has and that noses, I guess by definition, have. In the case of mil and mal, some authors have suggested that in the world, small objects resonate at higher frequencies than large objects. Small insects will buzz at a higher frequency than large insects. So the idea is that there is a sort of statistical regularity in the world that we humans pick up on, and that might underpin this sound symbolic association in our language. Anyway, so it's important to say that these kinds of sound symbolic associations are not deterministic, they're probabilistic. So as it happens, there are many languages in the world where the word for nose does not have a nasal sound in it. In fact, most languages in the world don't have that. But what's definitely true is that nasal sounds are overrepresented in words for nose, statistically. And people seem to be sensitive to these patterns of congruency and incongruency, as you've all seen. Like we intuitively can tell what the right answer is for some of these things. Okay, and people have argued that this sound symbolism effect has the function of scaffolding language acquisition for children. Children find it easier to acquire words that conform to these kinds of patterns. but there might be broader functions. It might be that sound symbolic effects can also facilitate the expression of emotion, attitude, or arousal. And this is where we come back to swearing. So as I mentioned, many authors have suggested that swear words have special properties that allow people to express frustration or abuse or emotion. So Ruth Wainrib was an Australian linguist. She says here that English swear words have sounds that contribute to a harsh emotive quality and lend themselves nicely for abuse. She mentions particularly here plosive sounds, k, p, and t, and fricative sounds as well. Geoffrey Hughes said that sounds such as b and f provide the most satisfying phonetic release of emotion. More recently, Ben Bergen, who's an American cognitive scientist, says that ending a word with a sound such as k or t brings the word to an immediate halt, and that's useful because these words are precisely the type you might want to be able to cut short and mumble into your beard. Anyway, so, just to come back to sci-fi for a second. So Michael R. Johnson, in his book, The Widening Gaia, one of the main characters in this book likes to swear in this language called Keldak because there's nothing as satisfying as the harsh consonants and default imperatives of the primary Kelvaki language. So there is this idea that swear words have properties that they're not totally arbitrary and random, that we might gravitate towards certain words that have certain sounds that allow us to express abuse or emotional frustration. But what's the evidence for this kind of contention? There's a couple of studies, but they're almost exclusively confined to English, or maybe one or two very closely related languages. So just to give a couple of examples, my favorite studies there's a study by Brendan Yardy, and he compared the sounds in English swear words with the sounds in carols, like Christmas carols, and lullabies like the songs that you might sing to soothe an infant. And he found that the swear words had more of these plosive sounds like p, t, and k, and lullabies had more sounds like l, y, w, and r. A couple more examples. So Ben Bergen has found that profane monosyllables are more likely than control monosyllables to end with one of these plosive sounds, p, t, or k. And this was an interesting study where participants were asked to create swearing compounds like shit arm or door ass, and novel taboo compounds that had plosives were considered better candidates for swearing. All right, so just to sum up the literature, there's some provisional evidence that English swear words contain a relative preponderance of these plosive sounds, p, t, and k, and that English native speakers are sensitive to this pattern. But no studies have looked at patterns across the full range of different sounds. They've tended to focus on these plosives. And also, we don't know whether, if there is a pattern for plosives, does it extend beyond English? Now, I'm an English native speaker, and I'm, of course, very used to everyone catering to my language and speaking my language, but at the same time, it's just one of many thousands of languages. There's nothing special about it. So an effect in English, as interesting as that might be, doesn't necessarily reveal anything about a human universal. And that's what, as psychologists, we're interested in human universals. So the idea for these studies was, could there be some kind of universal phonetic template for swear words that different swear words would gravitate towards? So we're looking for universal patterns in swear words. So it could be that an association in a particular language is just due to the historical contingent facts about how that language has evolved. Just to give an example, so in English, 40% of words that begin with GL relate to vision or light. But that's an effect that is not seen in distant languages. It's just kind of historically contingent to English and maybe one or two other languages. It doesn't reflect a human universal. All right, so I'm going to tell you about a couple of studies that I ran recently, which we published recently in Psychonomic Bulletin and Review. And in these studies, we explored sound regularities in swearing across distant languages, and we combined real-world data with some experiments that we ran. All right, so I'll just briefly run you through the three studies here. So our first study was a cross-linguistic comparison. So we recruited native speakers of distantly related languages: Hebrew, Hindi, Hungarian, Korean, and Russian. And we got these people to provide us with a list of the most offensive and vulgar words in their language. And actually, people really like doing that. So as a psychologist, I've given participants plenty of boring computer tasks, but I have rarely run a study where participants wrote to me and thanked me for participating. But this did happen in this study. So we asked people to consider the most vulgar words that are used in your language when someone gets hurt or frustrated, and the most offensive words that are used to curse someone, either to disparage or to insult them. So we collected these samples of words from these native speakers of these different languages. And then we statistically compared the sounds in these swear words with the sounds in control words in those languages. To do that, we used what's called the Swadesh list. This guy, Morris Swadesh, was an ethno-linguist, and he came up with a small list of basic concepts which has been translated into many, many different languages. So you can use it as a kind of control set. You can compare the sounds in the Swadesh list with the sounds in the swear word list. Anyway, what we found? So the first thing to say is that we did not find that plosives were more likely to occur in swear words than in the control words across these languages. So this kind of celebrated plosive effect, we did find it in English when we collected a sample for English, but we didn't find it across Korean and Hindi and Hungarian and whatnot. The best candidate that we found for a cross-linguistic pattern was that a group of sounds called approximants, and these are sounds like l, w, y, and r. They are less common in swear words across languages than in control words. Now, you might remember that when I mentioned the study about the lullabies tended to have a lot of these kinds of sounds, and so those sounds are just not found in swear words across distantly related languages. So it seems that they're not suitable sounds for expressing offense or offensiveness. Now, as I mentioned before, this is just a probabilistic effect. Like there are certainly going to be exceptions. You can probably think of examples of swear words in Italian that have these sounds, but it's just a statistical effect across languages. So anyway, then we moved on to our second study. So we reasoned that if these kinds of sounds are not suitable for expressing offensiveness, then are humans sensitive to this? Like if you have to listen to swear words in a foreign language and pick which one of them is the swear word, would you tend to avoid words that have those sounds in them? So that's what we did here. We ran some swear-dar experiments. The idea is, how good is your swear-dar? How good are you at identifying a swear word in a foreign language? So we set up some experiments. We recruited native speakers of a bunch of other languages. So we had Arabic and Finnish and Spanish and some others, which I'll show you in a sec. And what you had to do in this study was on each trial you heard two words and you had to pick which one was the swear word. So it's like maybe in Albanian, here are two words. Which one of these is the Albanian swear word? So here's an example. Not sure if that was very easy, but you'd have to identify which of those two words. Or here's another example. Docha and doya. So we set it up so that in each pair, one of the words had one of these approximate sounds. So doya has the y sound and docha is a control sound. So you had to identify which of these is most likely to be the swear word. And what we found is that across speakers of all of these languages, so yeah, Arabic, Chinese, Finnish, French and German and Spanish, people consistently avoided the word that had one of these approximate sounds in it. So if they were choosing randomly between them, they would be on this dotted line here. This is the vertical axis shows how likely you are to choose the word with the approximate sound, but people are below that line, so they avoid these sounds. So there seems that these sounds are not suitable for expressing offense, and people are sensitive to that. All right, so now in our third study, we came back to English for a study of what are called minced oaths. I'm not sure if you have this concept in Italian, but so a minced oath is a sanitized, safe version of a swear word. And so if you want to let off steam, but your grandmother is at the table, you don't want to say damn you to hell, like you might say darn instead, to use an English example. Or a more robust example might be, instead of saying shut the fuck up, you might say shut the front door. Like that's a safer, sanitized kind of version that you could use in the media, or yeah, I hope I'm not shocking anyone by using this language, but again, this is a talk on swearing. So anyway, yeah, so you form these words by altering one or more sounds in the original word. So the example here, transform damn to darn. And what we figured was that if these sounds, l, y, w, and r, if they're really unsuitable for expressing offensiveness, then it might, if you want to try and dampen the offensiveness of a word, you might want to introduce these kinds of sounds. So that was our hypothesis, that minced oaths would contain more of these approximate sounds than the swear words they were derived from. And to test this, we collected minced oaths from the Oxford English Dictionary, which is a massive resource of every English words. And we supplemented this with words that we found from Wikipedia. And we compared the number of approximates in the original and minced versions and basically counted them up and compared them statistically. And sure enough, the minced oaths contain more of these approximate sounds. But interestingly, plosives, again, don't matter. And this is even in English. So the safe versions of the words don't have fewer plosives than the swear words do. So approximate seems to be what's most important here. Now, just to give a little bit of take it into the political sphere, there's an interesting minced oath that's circulating in America, which is "Let's go Brandon." I'm not sure if anyone's familiar with this this phrase, what this means. Well, it means "fuck Joe Biden." So it's a kind of coded way of saying "fuck Joe Biden." But you see, like there's a Republican, Jeff Duncan, and Ted Cruz are happy to pose with this sign, so they're expressing this sentiment, but doing it in a minced way. Now, I don't want to make too much of it, but "Let's go Brandon" is also has a couple of approximate sounds that have been introduced into it, whereas "fuck Joe Biden" has no approximates. Anyway, this is just a bit of fun like it. So "Let's go Brandon" is both sort of semantically and phonetically sanitized. And this is Joe Biden swearing. He would probably be well advised to acquaint himself with the idea of minced oaths because he's been caught swearing on camera a few times. All right, so just to conclude, so swear words are powerful, potent words. Like their use is regulated in in the entertainment industry. They're subject of censorship. In many countries, it's illegal to use certain swear words. So they are powerful. Like they have all sorts of effects. They increase your heart rate, increase your skin conductance. There are some classic studies showing that if you swear, you can tolerate more pain. So there's some studies which get people like, well, you're getting an electric shock, and if you yell out "fuck," then you can tolerate more pain than if you yell out a control word. And you're more powerful in the gym when you swear. There's a few studies. So what makes swearing powerful? Obviously, part of the answer is going to be the semantics of swearing, the topics. So the usual suspects are things like sex, excretion, genitals, death, infirmity. All these kinds of topics are taboo topics. But we would argue that the sounds of swearing also contribute to their power. So the sounds of swearing are not actually arbitrary. So yeah, this just reviews what we said. We found that approximate sounds like l, y, w, and r are less suitable for expressing profanity than other sounds. Across languages, they're underrepresented in swear words. When people have to judge a swear word, people tend to avoid words with approximates. And when people seek to soften a swear word, you introduce these sounds. Rebecca Roach is a colleague of mine at Royal Holloway. She's a philosopher, and she's writing a book on swearing. And she, in one of her articles, said that trying to express anger using a swear word full of gentle, soft sounds would be the verbal equivalent of angrily trying to slam a door fitted with a compressed air hinge. I thought that was quite nice because it seems, I would suggest that these approximate sounds function as the compressed air hinge. You attach them to a word and it makes it harder to cause offense with that word. All right, so the implications are, firstly, sound symbolism might be more prevalent than previously thought and can fulfill more functions. And at the practical level, using kind of words rich with these sounds might help to diffuse social situations. This is a bit reaching, but anyway. All right, so are swear words universally patterned on the basis of sound, as Ruth Wainrib suggests here? Well, our results suggest a robust cross-linguistic pattern for human speakers. But as to the wider universe, the jury is out because, according to the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the most offensive, rudest word in the universe is Belgium, which contains one of these approximate sounds. So we need to do some further research to understand why that might be. All right, so now I've come to the end of the first part of my talk, and now I'm going to return to religion and come a little bit back more towards resilient beliefs. I've been interested in resilient beliefs for a long time, including religion, and one particular interest of mine is the relationship between religious beliefs and moral behaviour, and whether religion might promote moral behaviour and whether religious people are perceived as being more moral. So this is my kind of starting point for this part. Is it all right if I just blaze on and continue straight into the next part of the talk?
Sure.
I guess we can have questions and everything at the end. Okay, so the relationship between religion and morality has been discussed and debated for thousands of years. The idea that religion is somehow essential for morality has been expressed by poets and philosophers and politicians through the years. So a couple of examples here. The ancient Chinese philosopher Mozi suggested that belief in ghosts was essential for moral restraint. George Washington cautioned against indulging the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Dostoevsky famously in The Brothers Karamazov said, if God does not exist, everything is permitted. The idea of moral prohibitions might cease to carry weight without a deity. Laura Schlesinger is a popular radio DJ in America, and she has put things quite starkly. She says it's simply impossible for people to be moral without religion or God. That's quite a stark statement. But interestingly, across the world, a lot of people agree with that statement. So this is a Pew survey from a few years ago. And the question is, do you have to believe in God in order to be moral? So in America, 57%, so more than half of people say, yes, you have to believe in God. You can't be moral unless you believe in God. In Italy, and Britain, it's like much lower, but still, sizable proportion of the population think that belief in God is essential for morality. I'm sorry, you can't see the screen at all here. Yeah, sorry, that's not great. You haven't been able to see it. You're welcome to come over here and join me, please. Sorry, I didn't notice before. All right, so where am I? So a lot of people believe that you need, or at least explicitly endorse the claim that you need to believe in God in order to be moral. But one thing that's worth noting is, like in some of these countries down the bottom, like Egypt and Jordan and Kuwait, you see very high agreement with this idea there. But in some of those countries, it's actually illegal to renounce or abandon God. So there could be strong social pressures to respond in a certain way in surveys like this in some of these countries. So we were interested in looking at, in trying to have a more subtle way of asking this question, that doesn't involve just asking people, do you need to be moral to believe in God? So in a study that I was involved in a couple of years ago, we found global evidence of extreme intuitive moral prejudice against non-believers. And we used a technique which I'll show you now. So we showed people a vignette like this. When Bob was young, he began stealing things from supermarkets. This started out as just occasional shoplifting, but eventually progressed to more serious crime. As an adult, Bob has carried out some burglaries and even an armed robbery. So Bob is not a very nice guy. He's a bit of a bad dude, bad egg. The question is it more likely that Bob is a college professor, or B, that he's a college professor and does not believe in God? I'm not sure if you're familiar with this technique at all. Anyone have any suggestions here? Which is more likely, A or B here? B? A? Okay. Okay, so you know this fallacy. All right, so of course A is the correct answer. So this is the conjunction fallacy. This is the Kahneman-Tversky classic conjunction fallacy paradigm. So B is a fallacy because the conjunction of any two events can't be more probable than either of the events. So, but what we did in this study is we compared the rate at which people made the conjunction fallacy in this condition with another condition where the conjunction involved a college professor who believes in God. So we looked at the rate at which people gave the second answer. How likely are people to be seduced by this fallacy across those two conditions? And what we found is that people are much more likely to make the fallacy in the atheist target condition, roughly twice as likely across these 13 different countries that we surveyed with many thousands of participants. So across countries, people intuitively associate criminality with atheism. And interestingly, this was also the case even for people who were themselves atheists. So we asked people, how much do you believe in God on a 0 to 100 scale? If we restricted our analysis just to people who scored 0 on the scale, which is quite a strong indication of atheism, then people still are more likely to make the conjunction fallacy. So that's one nice thing about this method, about kind of getting under the surface of, because most atheists would explicitly disavow any connection between immorality and atheism. They would, well, many atheists at least don't like to think of there being an association, but intuitively people still intuit that there is an association. All right, so what kinds of consequences could this widespread moral distrust of atheists have? Well, to come back to American politics, you probably can't become president of the USA if you're an avowed atheist. This is an interesting study from a few years ago. This is from 2015, but it's recently been repeated with the same results. So Americans were asked, other things being equal, how likely would you be to elect as president someone who was a Catholic, a woman, Black, Hispanic, a Muslim, an atheist, etc. And 40% of Americans would not vote for an otherwise qualified candidate if they were an atheist. So you're more likely to get voted in if you're a Muslim in America than an atheist, and only poor socialists fared worse off here. Yeah, so they really don't like the socialists, but they don't like the atheists either. So in America, to be the president, you've got to be seen to be religious, and of course, people who are holding this office like to explicitly express prejudice against atheists. So George H.W. Bush said, I don't know that atheists should be considered citizens, nor should they be considered patriots. More recently, Ted Cruz, when he was trying to win the Republican nomination, said, any president who doesn't begin every day on his knees isn't fit to be commander-in-chief of this nation. That's a little bit ambiguous, actually, but yeah, I think he's talking about praying there. All right, so it's difficult to become the president of the US if you're an atheist, but of course this is fairly rarefied territory. Not many people would have the opportunity to become the president of the US anyway. So I was interested in what's a domain of life that more everyday people might encounter where this prejudice against atheists could have important consequences. And I would argue that it's in the judicial system, in the legal system. So I don't know how it is here in Italy, but in countries like Britain and America and Australia and Ireland, if you give evidence in court, you have to publicly declare that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. And classically, people will swear by Almighty God, so help me God, I'll tell the truth, the whole truth. But if you don't want to give the religious version of the wording in these countries, you don't have to. You can instead opt for a secular declaration where you basically really promise that you'll tell the truth. So that's called the affirmation. So in the British system, there's the oath and there's the affirmation, the religious one and the non-religious one. They've both got, they have the same legal force, so there's no legal distinction between them. So they're just considered to have the same legal effect, but the question is, do they actually have the same effect on judge and jury? So given that we know that people distrust atheists, it seems that this is a situation where you're kind of compelled by judicial procedure to signal your belief in God or otherwise in front of a jury of your peers in a scenario where credibility is absolutely paramount. So it seemed to me that this could have potentially serious consequences in the legal system. I actually got the idea for this study a few years ago. I got called up for jury service in the UK, and which is the only time I've done that, and it was a much more interesting experience than I thought it would be. The trial I was involved in was a bit kind of grim and grisly, but we heard all of these horrible things alleged of this defendant who was sitting at the back of the courtroom behind a glass wall. And on the third day of the trial, he took the stand, and each of us on the jury had to be sworn onto the jury, and we were presented with the religious wording or the secular wording. And I think it was only me and one other person out of 12 people who didn't go for the religious wording. And then so on the third day of the trial, this guy comes and takes the stand, and it's a pretty electric moment because we've heard all of these horrible things about this guy, and here he is. And our very first impression of him, like we're all craning forward, well, here's the guy, is which choice does he make, the religious choice or the non-religious choice? And I was sort of thinking, that's kind of interesting. Everyone here has chosen the religious wording. I know that people distrust atheists, so maybe that wasn't such a good decision for him to make. Anyway, so that's the point of departure for the studies that I'm going to tell you about now. So here's the two options. I swear by Almighty God, or I do solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that you will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. There is also the option to swear on different holy books in the UK at least, and this has had some sort of almost comical consequences. So there was a trial a few years ago that collapsed when a Muslim witness had emerged that he had sworn on the Bible instead of the Quran. Anyway, the trial wasn't going that well, and eventually it emerged that he was a Muslim, and they had to restart the trial. So it's not just an empty judicial procedure. But anyway. So sometimes when I've made this, raised this possibility that perhaps people might be unduly influenced by the religion or otherwise of a defendant, some people pour scorn on this idea for different reasons. So some people have argued that judge and juries are tasked with a very important social and civic responsibility, and they apply the facts of the case, or they apply law to the facts of the case in a rational, mechanical, and deliberative manner. That's the position which is called legal formalism. But we know from many studies that people don't actually do that. So just to give a couple of examples, some famous studies, judges with daughters will vote in a more feminist way on gender issues than judges with only sons. This is a classic one. Harsher sentences are rendered on Sleepy Monday than on Comparison Mondays. Sleepy Monday is in America that when you're on daylight saving, and then when you switch to daylight saving in the springtime, you lose an hour over the weekend. Also in the UK, so Sleepy Monday is the next Monday, but you've had one less hour of sleep in the week, and they find that judges give harsher sentences on that day. That on Comparison Mondays. And coming back to religion, mock jurors have been found to be least punitive when a defendant is described as having converted to Christianity compared to a more generic appeal for Christian forgiveness. So there are these different factors, extraneous factors, which seem to affect judicial decision-making. So I've been arguing for a couple of years that we should abolish the oath, and this is a completely unnecessary and unfair legal ritual that we have in these countries. Another reason that people have pushed back against this argument is that some people have pointed out to me, well, the affirmation, just because you take the affirmation, that doesn't mean that you're an atheist, because the affirmation was actually introduced for certain religious groups. So there are religious groups like Quakers and Mennonites who interpret scripture in such a way as to prohibit the swearing of oaths. So some religious groups will not swear oaths. And in the UK, there was this Quakers Act of 1695, and at that point, you were allowed to take an affirmation instead of an oath. So choosing the affirmation could be a sign of religious integrity rather than a sign of atheism. So people have often said, you don't know it, you can't infer anything about whether someone is a believer or not by the decision that they make. Now, I always think, well, I don't think too many people on the jury would be aware of the historical origins of this piece of legislation, but nevertheless, it is an empirical question. What do people infer about someone's religiosity based on what declaration they choose? So I'm going to tell you about a couple of studies that we did. But firstly, there have been, so if you're sworn in as president of the USA, you also have to either take the oath or the affirmation. And there have been 2 instances in American history when a Quaker was elected president, Nixon in the late 60s and Herbert Hoover in the 1920s. And in both of these cases, they chose the oath rather than the affirmation. So even though they were Quakers, I don't know, for whatever reason, didn't want to be seen as avoiding the religious wording in this scenario. Anyway, so I'm going to briefly run through a couple of studies that we've run. So the first study, we wanted to ask, are people who choose the oath actually more religious than people who choose the affirmation? And are people who choose the oath perceived as more religious than those who affirm? And I was also interested in what reasons do people have for choosing one declaration or the other. So we had hundreds of participants in this study. You probably don't need to know the details too much, but we asked people whether they'd ever given evidence in a British court. If so, we asked which declaration they had made. If people hadn't actually given evidence, we asked which declaration they would hypothetically choose and why. And then we gave people 2 vignettes of some hypothetical witnesses, one who had taken the oath and one who had taken the affirmation. And the participants had to indicate what they inferred about the person's religiosity as a function of whether they took the oath or the affirmation. And people also indicated their own belief in God and their own religious affiliation. And what we found is that people who chose the oath were vastly more religious than those who chose the affirmation. So on a 0 to 100 scale, the mean belief of those who took the oath, this is in a UK sample, was 55. But of those who chose the affirmation, it was 18. So people who choose the oath are more religious than people who choose the affirmation, irrespective of what people think about Quakers and Mennonites and whatnot. And importantly, people who are described as having taken the oath are perceived as more religious than those who chose the affirmation. Now, this might seem kind of pretty obvious, but it was an important piece of the puzzle because I've just had this objection so many times that you can't infer anything about someone's religiosity by looking at what declaration they take. It seems that people do infer something and also that it's an accurate signal of their religiosity. All right. In terms of why people choose the oath or the affirmation, the most common reason given was belief in God or lack thereof. But some people did choose on the basis of how credible their testimony would appear. So I'll give a couple of examples here. These are people who chose the oath. They said, I believe the oath would be perceived as more credible by the jury, or I think the oath sounds like I'll tell the truth more than the affirmation. This person chose the affirmation, and when asked why, they said, well, I'm not religious, although I might swear an oath if I was planning on lying. So that was quite interesting and quite stark. All right, so in our second study, we wanted to know, can the type of legal declaration chosen by defendants influence perceptions of their actual guilt, right? Not just their religiosity, but how likely they are to be guilty. So we hypothesized that defendants who choose the oath would be perceived as less likely to be guilty than those who choose to affirm. And we also thought that effect would be influenced by how religious the onlooker was. We thought that religious people would be more likely to associate the oath with innocence than non-religious participants. In this study, we had nearly 1,000 participants, and it was a very simple paradigm. We just showed people a description of the oath and the affirmation, and then we gave them some brief information about a defendant, and we asked people to indicate the guilt of the defendant. So this is the information. We said, Alan is a 37-year-old British man who recently stood trial for the murder of his wife. Assuming he chose to swear an oath or make an affirmation, depending on which condition they were in, how likely do you think it is that he's guilty of the murder of his wife? All right, now people used the slider to indicate how guilty he was. Now we let people, so the slider was from 0 to 100, but we let people sit exactly on the fence if they wanted to, exactly in the middle. And a lot of people actually did that. So just looking at the data, more than half of people sat perfectly on the fence. So this is only of interest statistically. It means that we had to use bootstrapping for our statistics. But basically the bottom line is that overall defendants who chose the affirmation were perceived as slightly more likely to be guilty than people who chose the oath. And this was moderated by religion. So just to show you this graph here. So on the horizontal axis, I can't read it here because something's covering. I can't read it there because it's very small. But it's how religious the the participant was. On the horizontal axis is how religious you are. On the left-hand side, you're not very religious at all. On the right-hand side, you're very religious. And what you're doing is judging how guilty the defendant is, and your guilt score is on the vertical axis. And as a function of whether the defendant took the affirmation in pink or the oath in blue, what you can see is that for people who are not religious, they didn't discriminate between these two declaration choices. But the more religious people were, the more they thought that the affirming defendant was guilty. So yeah, there's this interesting interaction with religion here. All right, I'll skip over this because this is a bit of nicety. All right, so a couple of caveats. So our effects here are quite small. They're statistically significant, but they're not big effects. But this is a scenario where the stakes are really high, I would argue. So in some scenarios, small effects might be kind of meaningless and not have any important social consequences or whatnot. But it's not quite life or death, but it's life. These kinds of judicial decisions have important implications for people's lives. And another problem here is that this situation was very artificial and contrived. So we wanted to have a more elaborate follow-up study. So just to tell you, in our final study, we ran a kind of a mock trial, like a much more detailed courtroom scenario. So we had nearly 2,000 participants do this trial. What we did is we created a video of a trial, and everything in the video, we had two conditions, and which were completely identical, but in one condition, the defendant in the trial took the oath, and in the other condition, the defendant took the affirmation. Now, if you were watching this trial, you had no idea what the study was about. You just watched the trial, then you had to judge how guilty this person was. But we also got people to swear onto the jury. In the same way that you do in a real trial, you have to either take the oath or the affirmation. So we did that at the beginning because we were interested in whether that might influence the way people respond react to the defendant. All right, so yeah, people acted as jurors in an audio-visual mock trial. Yes, we had these two conditions, oath and affirmation. People had to give a verdict for the defendant, and jurors themselves swore or affirmed that they would hear the evidence faithfully. So we used so there have been many different mock trial studies in psychology. We used the transcript that's been used in many other studies, but we adapted it for the British context, and we made it, rather than just have people read it, which is what people often do, we made it a bit more real. Just to give an example.
Thank you for contributing your valuable time to this important community service. Your role today is to determine a verdict of guilty or not guilty as to the accused, the evidence, based solely on the information presented in this trial.
Right, so that just gives you an example. This is how it went. People went through this trial and they heard introductory remarks by the prosecutor and the defence. And
Benjamin Evans
yeah.
confronted John and Louise Bradshaw while they were walking on Bishop's Avenue, demanding their money and jewellery.
Anyway, this just gives you an idea of the way it works. But once we get to the defendant, so here's the defendant, and he's sworn in here. He either took. So I'm just showing you a couple of select bits from the trial.
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
That's the oath. So people either got that condition or they got this condition.
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
All right. They're actually members of my wife's family. The judge was my mother-in-law, as it happens. So in terms of results, overall, the defendant wasn't considered guiltier when affirming rather than swearing. But we found an interesting result, whereas the jurors who themselves swore an oath when being sworn on, they did discriminate against the affirming defendant. So here, on the x-axis, we've got whether the juror took the affirmation on the left or took the oath on the right, and they're judging a defendant who took the affirmation or the oath. And so if you were a participant, a juror who took the oath, they tended to find the affirming defendant more likely to be guilty. So this was I'm not sure how much you know about like pre-registration and whatnot. So in psychology, as in some other sciences, in the past few years, there's been a bit of a crisis of confidence in the reliability of research results. Part of the problem is that people have a lot of flexibility in how they can do their analyses. You can analyze things every which way until you get a significant effect. So this is what's called a registered report. So this study was peer reviewed before we ran the study. So the methods and the analyses are peer reviewed, several rounds of review, and they're then locked in before we were able to collect the data. So we cannot then deviate from the result, the analysis that we did. So this analysis here is one of our pre-registered, and it's not analysis that we just found after the fact. It's one of the analyses that that was peer reviewed in advance. We need to do this to see whether this has an effect. This analysis, however, was an exploratory analysis. So this wasn't pre-registered. We just looked around, but we wanted to try and understand the effect a bit more. So we also measured authoritarianism, and we found that this effect is really strong amongst high authoritarian jurors. So people who are authoritarian really care a lot about tradition, and they tend to be more religious as well. So it seems like this effect could be being driven by authoritarianism. Anyway, so in light of effects like this, which I think have the potential to gravely disadvantage non-believers in court, I personally think that the oath should be abolished. There have been some previous attempts to abolish the oath. Interestingly, in 2013, there was a motion in England and Wales to end the swearing of oaths. Interestingly, opponents of this motion, who included church leaders, ironically, they argued that we should keep the oath because it strengthens the value of a witness's evidence. So this is almost agreeing with, to me, that's the whole reason why you should do away with the oath, because there shouldn't be a difference in strength of evidence as a function of which declaration somebody takes. So we all agree that the oath is perceived as strengthening the value of a witness's evidence, but I think that's a reason to do away with the oath rather than a reason to keep it. So I would argue that the oath is an antiquated feature of the legal system that needs reform, and that continued use of the oath may make justice more difficult to obtain for those who are unwilling to swear by God they do not believe in. And just to connect back with the first part of my talk again, so I told you about minced oaths, which are this kind of sanitized version of swear words, where you kind of take out the active ingredient of the swear word, and you end up with a safer kind of version. Or it seems to me that the affirmation, you could think of it as almost a minced oath. It's a version of the oath that takes God out of the equation, and it could be that that's really a key ingredient that many people attend to in trials. So yeah, I think that's this is perhaps of more practical interest than theoretical or philosophical interest, but it shows how certain resilient beliefs can affect the way that people are perceived and can make justice more difficult to obtain for certain groups. Anyway, that's actually the end of my talk, so thank you.